Beloved and friends, you exist to make much of something, just not yourself. You exist to make much not of yourself, but of God. You have your life and being. You move and have your being to make much not of your life and your movement and your being, but to make much of Christ. And until we are gripped by that, and until that truly does a work of transforming the way we think, you will not come to understand what it means to say that you exist to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. This is your chief purpose. And please do not ever grow tired of being reminded that you are loved in Christ, and in Christ your purpose is fulfilled, and you are called as a people to join together with the strength that only the Spirit can provide, and that is to make much of Christ in all things and enjoy Him forever. This is so critically important. And beloved and friends, listen. It's true in marriage. For marriage exists to make much, not of marriage, but of its maker, of its master. The fact that you exist to make much not of you, but of Christ, is also the fact that marriage itself exists and is to be stewarded, to be revered, to be honored, to be upheld, and to be valued, to make much of Christ. Of this, we have a profound reminder today. A profound reminder before us. But I must caution all of you. In fact, I'm going to ask you all to stop in your tread of thinking. Because we cannot approach this sacred book like we do an encyclopedia. Treat it like a concordance of personal concern. Looking up headings and saying, well, I'm interested in thinking about marriage today, so I'm going to go look and see what the Bible has to say about it. This is not a simple handbook or a manual for how you should live. The Gospel of Matthew is the good news of Matthew, and it's not Matthew that's the good news. And it's not the way you should live that's the good news. The good news of Matthew is a biography. It's a biography about the one who is good news, the most important life that ever lived, and the only death that ever gave life. This is a biography about Jesus Christ. So when we read from chapter 18 to 19, it's not like we're looking upon a sage who's running around dispensing fortune cookies for us to consume this topic and that topic, and what's he going to tell us today? That's not the point. There's an argument going on. God is unfolding and revealing to all of us the glory of this one most precious life, to draw us in, to understand who it is we call Lord, for us to worship and become more like Him, to make Him known. This isn't for us to make marriage known as much as it is for us to make Christ known. The issue that I'm trying to strive at is, this is, in the end, we discover this is more about Christ than anything else. Would you look with me quickly at verse 1, Matthew 19, verse 1. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, He went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed Him, and He healed them there. Now, this actually constitutes a preamble. It's sort of like a transitional introduction to the next section. The next chapter in this biography of Jesus. And in this, what he presents right here, now when Jesus finished these sayings, what sayings? Well, the ethics to the embassy. When He brought the 12 and He brought the boys in and said, now listen, I'm going to teach you about these ethics, starting with humility, ending with forgiveness. Here are the ethics that you need to have as my representative ambassadors on earth in a foreign land, pilgrims, sojourners. You represent me in my kingdom, so you're the embassy. And now He leaves. He leaves Galilee. And as He leaves Galilee, it's something unique here. It's a definitive departure, not just another trip. It marks the beginning of the end. The gears are in motion, and now the ball is rolling, and it will not stop until we hit the cross. The king has set his face, like Luke says, like a flint. He set his face to Jerusalem. It's striking, isn't it? I mean, we just heard him twice in 16 and chapter 17. We heard Jesus explain, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to be killed. And now he's saying, boys, come on, let's go to Jerusalem. There's something here about his sovereignty, something about the fact that he's not a victim, he's a victor, and he's in control, not being controlled. This is fulfillment, not failure. But the journey is interesting. He leaves Galilee, mark it down in your hearts, and he will not come back to Galilee until he has been crucified and risen. It's a distinctive, definitive departure. And I find it very symbolic. It marks a new section from chapter 19 all the way to the end of chapter 20 is one section. Because chapter 21 begins, if you want, just take a look there. Chapter 21, verse 1. What does it say? Now when they drew near to Jerusalem. Okay. So chapter 19 and 20 constitute one large unit. And it's symbolic. The journey is symbolic. They're leaving Galilee and they're going to Jerusalem for the last time. And the symbolism I suggest is something like the geography pointing to theology. Because after all, the Jerusalem has been known and is promised for Israel for centuries. That's the capital of the kingdom. So there's something symbolic here going on, and it's the picture that in this new section, it's calculated that every step along the way on this journey, there's something about Jesus reorienting his disciples to a new center and a new paradigm. It is as though on this way to the capital, it's like a journey to the kingdom. They're learning here that the king is leading them. And he's leading them to and in toward the kingdom. But there's rich irony, isn't there? Because, they think, well, now's the time he's going to set up the kingdom. That's chapter 24. Once they're there in Jerusalem, they've been there for a week, and things aren't going well. And they're like, oh, okay, Jesus, you see these buildings? I mean, isn't this great? Are you going to set up your kingdom? And he's like, no. You're thinking over here, and Jesus is working somewhere deeper. The real painful failure that they demonstrate is a failure to discern the necessity, the need for the cross. You see, the cross had no place in the economy of their view of the kingdom. And that's a lesson for us. We're learning what it means to reorient and live with a Christ-centered kingdom-word life. It's something very rich. So as Jesus approaches his cross, he's reorienting them toward his kingdom. Christ and his cross then should define and redefine his people. As he's taking them, it's like he's going to teach them. And in fact, it's unique here. Chapter 19 is different than 18. 19 and 20 deal with something where it's largely not just the ethics of how the church should be, because he's going to talk to crowds and Pharisees, but rather he uses the foil of the culture. It's the culture that's the background. It's their conventions. It's the way they think. It's the conventions of their thinking and their values and their priorities, and he's going to systematically unravel them. He's reorienting his people to a whole new center and paradigm. That's what we find. And it's all about the kingdom. If you look with me, just chapter 19, each one of these principles here is about the kingdom. He's going to talk about the kingdom. Look at verse 12. He says in verse 12 at the end, for the sake of the kingdom. In verse 14 at the end, belongs to the kingdom. In verse 23, enter the kingdom of heaven. In verse 28, the new world or regeneration or the the kingdom to come in chapter 20, verse 1. For the kingdom. Look at chapter 20, verse 21 at the end. The kingdom. And again, in chapter 20, verse 30 at the end, two blind men see Christ as the Son of David. Now, what this section really presents is one unit of thought. So what holds together? Well, let me show you a principle here of just considering how you understand this. In chapter 19, verse 1 to 9, talks about marriage. 10 to 12, singleness. 13 to 15, children. And then you find in verse 16 to 26, it's about wealth, a rich young ruler. 27 to 30, sacrifice of wealth. And chapter 20, verse 1 to 16 is labor for wealth. Now, I want to challenge you and I want to call you to see something. In this unit of thought, what do you think? What do you think about this? Well, first of all, marriage singleness, as a side note, marriage singleness and children, what does that constitute? Family. Wealth, the side note about personal sacrifice of wealth and labor. What does that constitute? Financial prosperity. I ask you the question, what does a low view of family and a high view of financial prosperity have in common? What does a low view of family and a high view of financial prosperity have in common? Self. Self-interested, self-satisfying self. That's what it has in common. A self-seeking life undermines marriage and family, which is the most fundamental unit of God's creative design for humanity. Why are we here talking about marriage today? Well, because this is the first subject in dealing with self. As he gets out into the crowds, as he deals with society, as he begins to orient their thinking towards the kingdom instead of the culture, he has to begin first where society begins first, the family. And it's an unraveling of sorts and a reconstructing. It is very powerfully centered not on self, but on Christ. In fact, look at verse 30 with me. 19:30. What does it say? But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. Look at 20:16. What does it say? So the last will be first, and the first last. You see, this unit is punctuated with this idea of self. Self. Now, with this in mind, I want us to remember that nothing is left untouched in the paradigm of the kingdom. A Christ-centered kingdom-ward life, everything is touched by Christ. Everything is touched by the principles that he's going to present here. Marriage is families transformed, and your entire outlook on pursuits of wealth and success, everything is transformed. Self is not center. Now, the issue here is that family life and social life take on a renewed and future-looking design. It's beautiful because remember, look at chapter 19, verse 1 or verse 2. Large crowds followed him and he healed them. What is this Christ, this King of Kings? What is he doing here? This is a summary statement about what he has come for. Healing is a picture, of two things. First of all, the healing is a restoring, right? There was health and it has been lost, and healing restores that health. Well, that's a picture, it's a metaphor, it's a parable that talks even about the grand design of paradise being lost and the Messiah coming to heal a cursed and lost world, heal it back to its paradise. But it's also future looking because none of these healings were permanent. So it's a taste of what is to come in the kingdom. It's a credential that he carries and he shows the world, I am the one who has the power to bring in the kingdom. Look, I heal. The promises of the kingdom are in me and me alone. So we get from this idea that what he's going to say about family, what he's going to say about prosperity, all these things are going to be transformed, recalibrated, new focus on this Christ in a restoring and forward-looking manner. He's going to talk about marriage, for instance, according to its original design. And it's going to be forward-looking in its strength. He's going to talk about prosperity in terms of its original design and forward-looking in its power and strength. This is, again, a new paradigm. It's a Christ-centered paradigm. And so he's going to touch on marriage, on singleness, and on children. We'll look at those as the Lord allows us to gather. I want to show you one last thing. I've only described part of that unit, right? Chapter 21 is when they enter in and start into Jerusalem. So, well, what's remaining in this unit? In this toward the kingdom unit? Well, first, what I like to label these two things, because again, what does a low view of family and a high view of financial prosperity have in common? Self. So I like to label it the satisfying self. He's addressing the satisfying self in each of these vignettes. See, these aren't fortune cookies. I'm going to talk about children. I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about that. There's a line of thought. There's a progress. And it comes to a very powerful and culminating head before the close of the unit. So the satisfying self is contrasted with the suffering servant. Look at verse 17 with me. This is chapter 20, verse 17. And as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, it's almost as if right there in the middle, he wants to remind them, no, we're still going, but now we're closing out this unit. As Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and he will be raised on the third day. Beloved and friends, listen carefully. The pride of a self-seeking life is all the more repugnant when it is placed next to the portrait of the suffering servant. And that's exactly what we have. Low view of family, all about self. High view of personal prosperity, I'll sacrifice family, sacrifice marriage, sacrifice everything for my gain. All about self. Put that right next to, I'm going to Jerusalem to be crucified, to suffer. That's the one that Isaiah talked about. What's glorious here is that it's a striking, that suffering servant becomes the key point to the rest of this unit. And it's no coincidence that verse 20 now, we find John and James wanting to have status. Who's going to sit at the right hand of Jesus? And you know what he does? He teaches them a lesson in this unit where he says, it's not status, but a Christ-centered kingdom word life involves suffering, not status. You follow the brand of a suffering servant. You, if you call yourself a Christian, you follow the brand of a suffering servant. But notice how that's kind of a side note, because then he brings it back to this idea of his suffering. And how does he close it all out? Oh, you remember it well. He says, the Gentiles lord it over the people. That's how they lead. The kingdoms of the world lead by subduing their subjects. And I love what he says in verse 26, and it shall not be so among you. For I, the Son of Man, have come not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. Jesus is the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. And he says, that's what I've come to do, and that's the likeness of what you should be. In contrast to the satisfying self, he is teaching about the suffering servant. And then there's no coincidence, beloved friend. Just look there, verse 29 to the end of the unit. How does the unit transition now into Jerusalem? How does the unit close out its thought? Only by the idea that the Old Testament required 2 witnesses. Isn't it ironic? You have 2 blind men who can't see to be a witness. So Jesus gives them sight, and they call him Son of David. And it's right then that they go, and they're going to enter into the kingdom. Look at chapter 21, look at verse 5. Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, behold. Only seeing men can behold. Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey. Beloved and friends, that's the point of the transition. We now have 2 witnesses that see Jesus, declare him Son of David. He is the King of Kings. The kingdom is coming, yet he's humble. Well, there's our unit. And I know that when we come to the scriptures like this and get a grip on its context and understand, because context is king, right? Well, we don't, it's not an encyclopedia. You don't just flip through to a topic heading. It's context revealing this Christ. Well, now, beloved and friends, we are in a much better place of thinking. We will think now in better categories. I dare say we will think in the categories that were intended for us to understand what he's now going to say. That is critical. This is not random. It's not disconnected. And what we discover is that it's not all about marriage. It's all about Christ. You see, because here's the deal. Christ doesn't serve to make much of marriage. Marriage serves to make much of Christ. And that's the point here. And so I pray that we would give our heart's attention to this truly for his glory and indeed for the good and for the joy, for the gladness of every family in this room and through you, even to the families of the nations. Let's take a look at this. To begin with, we've got to understand the test. So let's just look at the test. Look at verse 3. How does this set up? Why are we talking about marriage? Why is marriage the first subject? How did we get here? Well, remember verse 1 where it said that he entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan? That's important. Because every time we've seen Jesus in Matthew, every time we've seen him leave Galilee, it's north. He's going north, he's going north, he's going north. He's going to Gentile territory. But now he goes where? Only to the exact center of the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. Now, what's the big deal about Herod Antipas? Well, only this, that he just executed John the Baptist because John the Baptist addressed him on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And now Jesus happens to go right there. And the first question that he's asked by Pharisees is, so is it lawful to divorce for any reason? Striking. When John dealt with the question, it led to imprisonment and execution. Maybe that's the Pharisees' intent here. Not by their own doing, but by the sovereignty of God, this will as well. So verse 3 is the test. In the likeness of John the Baptist. Look at verse 3 with me. The Pharisees came to him. Oh, and don't miss this. Mark it. That's formal. It came to him is not just, they happened to come. They formally intended, they came to him. Just like it's formal in Matthew 4:3, where it says that the tempter came to him. So they came to him and tested him by asking. So here's the deal. They ask a question, but don't miss this. They are not interested in what Jesus thinks about marriage. This isn't the inquisitive, curious folk that just, well, what would you say, Rabbi? No, they are seeking to trap him. They want to trap him. They're trying to present to him a dilemma. Isn't this typical, though? Isn't this the typical pattern of unbelief, right? Think with me. They don't believe that Jesus is the Christ. So they have a pre-commitment to get rid of him. Their efforts to ask questions, these aren't efforts to learn more about him and maybe work things out. These are efforts because of their pre-commitment. They just want to get rid of him. Being in science and evangelizing on airplanes and on streets and throughout laboratories and in academic circles and in Belgium giving lectures and all over the place, I deal with all kinds of intellectual challenges to the faith. And I dare say that nearly every single time, this is the pattern I encounter. There's not a genuine interest. Instead, it's a calculated question to discredit. I'm going to come at you with a question to undermine. I'm going to put you in a position where you can't answer in a way that pleases all. In fact, I'm going to pose a question to you that will force you to offend people. That's what's going on. Force you to offend people. You see, in this day, there was a very prevalent and widespread and very divisive controversy, a debate over marriage, divorce, and remarriage. There were two schools of thought in the Jewish culture. That one was the Beit Hillel and the other Beit Shammai. And these two schools of thought had different approaches to the answer based upon one text, and that's Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 through 4. It happened to be that at this time, the issue was theological and political. So coming to Jesus to ask this question was to put him on the horns of a dilemma. Either way he answered, he was going to offend. There was no winning. It was just like the question, shall we give taxes to Caesar? There was no winning that, or at least they thought. And that's the same thing they're doing here. There's no way he's going to win. Yeah, there are people passionately on one side or the other. So they pose the question. It's kind of like politics today. Can't really talk about it without offending people. And they're passionate one side or the other. That's what it's like here, but even worse. And I want to submit to you this. This is a very critical thing to think about. As I thought about, so why this subject? Why now? I'm going to tack this thing to my head. Why now? Why? Why? I've given you the breakdown of the passage, but why marriage? Why now? Why first? And I just think with me. Because there's probably, at least one additional reason is because there's probably no other subject that you hold so dear as your private, personal autonomy than the subject of your romance. Nobody's going to tell me who to love, who not to love, who to marry, how to live or divorce or remarry. You want to talk about passion, you want to talk about deep, deep, deep roots of feeling and emotion, everything from pain, deep pain, and everything all the way to passionate social activism. Talk about marriage. It's a fundamental, deep-rooted, and personally passionate subject. So if you want to get a public figure in trouble, put him on the horns of a dilemma where everyone's divided. Maybe some in this room. I invite you to behold the majesty of this King. Watch this. They ask, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Halakhic in Hebrew, it's a form of debate. Any cause? What do you say, Rabbi? What do you say? Well, this is what Jesus says, effectively. Let me give you a paraphrase. Wrong question. Let me give you another paraphrase. Wrong authority. I decline to engage on your terms in this debate. I own the debate. And I will redefine all the terms. Jesus ignores their whole debate tactic, and he completely destroys the trap. Leaves them stunned. You know they don't even answer. It takes the disciples with jaws dropped to ask a question like, oh, really? There's no answer, no rebuttal. Now, with this in mind, I must give a brief pastoral insert. If I were just academically doing this, I would just continue on to show you some amazing things, and I wish I had more time, but that's not what this is all about. This is really more very personal, and it should be worship to the Lord our God. And I serve not as an academician, not as just an expositor, but as a shepherd. And I express my love to all of you. And one of the things I must acknowledge is that few things are more painful than divorce. And I openly acknowledge that undoubtedly every single person in this room has been touched by divorce. Either personally, directly, or through someone you know and love, family or friends. Divorce is deeply painful. And some of you might be dreading even this message. And I just want to acknowledge that and express my care. This is not intended in any way from me to resurface pain, but it is intended to make much of Christ. And where any of you have been caught in the pain of divorce, I pray that by the end, you might be renewed in the grace of the gospel. For this King is a gracious and loving King and welcomes the least of us. I must also confess that we live in a time and place of deplorable impoverishment when it comes to marriage. Our view of marriage is absolutely deplorable as a nation. We have things like we talk about irreconcilable differences, and so just get a divorce. Or no-fault divorces. I could spend time in nearly every message I heard, they gave you all these statistics. I'm not going to give you a bunch of statistics. It's just too depressing. One that does stand out that is just incredible is, according to the numbers in America, the divorce rate has increased 700% since the 1800s. The point that I'm after here is a low view of marriage undermines God's design not only for self, not only for family, but for society. And it's not unique to our time. Would you look with me at 19 verse 10? What does it say in verse 10? This is how the disciples respond. If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. Where does that come from? But from a cultural mindset that has such an impoverished view of marriage, that the way that Jesus presents it is so powerful, so glorious, so magnanimous, that it consumes us and demands more than we have. And they say, even the disciples of Jesus say, if that's the way marriage is to be lived, then maybe we shouldn't even get married. So I say all of this as a shepherd to extend out love and care and compassion for those of you who hurt through this subject, and also to connect with you and remind everyone, young and old, of the relevance of this passage. Even if you're a child out there right now, please listen. Grab what you can. Even if you're not thinking about marriage. You are, if you claim Christ, if you seek out the Lord, you are responsible to know His will and His purposes in marriage. And we, by the way, beloved and friends, we are the church. We are the pillar and the buttress of truth. We are the only people in the world who can proclaim this message. Are you with me? So let's see. Behold the mastery of this king. And let's see his comments on marriage. I only have 2 points, very simple, very direct, and powerful. The first is this, is going to be that Jesus is the maker of marriage. Number one, Jesus is the maker of marriage. Let's look at how we see that. In verse 4, he responds. They ask, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? He responds, have you not read that He who created? Oh yeah, okay, are you with me? Now listen, this is the key. The issue here is you come to me with a cultural question. And you're thinking in terms of Hallel and Shammai. You're all wrong. Because your mind is set on the things of man, not on the things of God. Just like he told Peter, get behind me, Satan. Your mind is set on the things of man, not the things of God. The issue here is the same. He's saying this. You want to talk about marriage, do you? You want to ask about divorce, do you? Here's your fundamental problem. You don't know God. Have you not read that He, do you see it? Have you not read that He, you want to come to me with Deuteronomy and try to work out case law. Have you not read that He, God is where your focus should be. God should be the center of your thinking about marriage and divorce. God should define and redefine it all. Have you not read that He, beloved and friends, mark it down. Ignorance of God will always distort creation. Ignorance of God will always distort humanity. You want to know why we have so many problems? And again, I'm not going to bore you with all the stats, LGBTQ and everything else under the sun. You know why? Because there's no God in their view. Have you not read that He, it's not about you, it's not about them, it's not about our social constructs, inventions of men, little contracts. It's not about that. It's about God, the living God. This matters more to Him than any of us. And there's our fundamental problem. It's like the Puritans used to say, we play marbles with the diamonds of God. These things are precious to Him, and we dink around with them. This is not ours, it's His. Have you not read that He who created? And there's that fundamental issue. I love how He responds. He just flat out says, don't come to me with your case law. Also, it proves something, doesn't it? A bit of legalism. It's almost like this. You could follow Deuteronomy 24 to the T. You could follow the letter of the law, and your heart could be far from God. Sure, you could walk through that case law, and you could obey it to the T. You could be the legalist, and you could be totally lost. Godless. The heart of God is not in you when you think like this. That's what he's saying. Between the lines, the heart of God, you're not thinking with the mind that is set on God. When you get wrapped up in the debate over marriage, divorce, remarriage, and who defines marriage and how should marriage be done, if you're not thinking on God, you're not thinking rightly. You know, and as far as this idea of case law, I'll get to that in a moment, but this whole thing in Deuteronomy was an exception. Exceptions never make rules, not good rules. Let me make this clear. What Jesus is going to reveal is very, very powerful. He says that he who created them from the beginning, it's as though he jumps back before the Mosaic law, before the covenant with Israel, before anything else, and he jumps all the way back to what? Before sin. He goes into the realm of paradise. And it's as though he's saying, you see that? That creation order actually points to a moral order. The creation tells you something about the moral design. It's fascinating how Jesus does this. Jesus, he goes in and he deals with this idea that the moral creation presents a guide for moral order, and it remains even after the fall. So that his deepest interest is the purpose and the intent of marriage. You know, let's just think about this before we dive into that. It's as if right here, and it's as if in 2015 when our Supreme Court decided that they're going to legislate something about marriage, it's as if people think, well, you know, that definition of marriage is passé, it's antiquated, it's outdated. We need to upgrade. We need to have some kind of a renewed, a new version. The old is not sufficient. Well, here's my proposition. God designed marriage from the beginning, and it can never be outdated. Marriage in God's design will never become outdated. It is transcendent. It transcends cultures, it transcends places, it transcends time. And so let me just offer you an image that may help. It helps me. When I look at automobiles and I see cars, I can understand that a certain model might need upgrading sometime. I might need to get a newer car because, well, you know, it's going to become outdated, especially if you have one of those that run on ethyl, you know, like before 1958, or you got the 6-volt system. I mean, you got to get a new version to live, to be relevant. Otherwise, it's outdated. Some people treat marriage that way. But here's what I'm going to suggest to you. Don't think of it like the model of the car. Think of it like the wheel. From the beginning, the wheel was designed, and guess what? It never needs to be improved. You don't redesign a wheel. The wheel is always the same. It's always perfect in its design. That's the idea of marriage. And just like wheels are served in so many capacities all over mechanics, it's the same design that's used always in whatever new models you put on the wheels. But the wheel design stays the same. And that's true with marriage. No matter what culture, no matter what time, no matter what place you put on the wheel, marriage is always the same. It is designed by God from the beginning to be a perpetuating model that always is designed to bring him glory and bring joy to humanity. And the practical function of serving God's purposes for humanity in society. Isn't this good? We've got to think in these terms. We've got to remember this. And one last picture. I love to think about logic and the laws of logic and the transcendental argument for the existence of God. It's another thing. We'll talk about that later. But the idea of the laws of logic, look, none of us get new versions of the laws of logic. If you do, it's called illogical or delusional. They put you in a nice little funny farm with jackets that don't have sleeves or they're tied up. And you don't define laws of logic or redefine laws of logic. You are not over laws of logic. You are under them. They are created. They are transcendental. You subject yourself to them. They rule you. Beloved and friends, marriage is the same. No court, No people, no groups of people, no legislation, and no groups of government could ever change the authoritative rule and design, purpose, and function of marriage. Marriage does not belong to man. Marriage belongs to God. He gives it graciously to all people, not just Christians, not just believers, but every single precious person made in the image of God. Marriage is sacred for everyone. It is God's design. He is the maker. Now, let's look and dive in just briefly into some of these points about just the picture of what Jesus then wants to show us about this design. Verse 4, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? First and foremost, he makes it very clear. The design of the human body, the design of the human being, the anatomy of human gender is itself tied to the principle of marriage. It is a deplorable abomination to talk about marriage that breaks the very created design of male and female. No man or group of people could ever redefine this. And remember, he says, he created them from the beginning. Creation should tell you a little something about the morality of it. Like, a man and a man should never be married. The created design of their anatomy only tells you the story. The male and female, isn't that his logic? His logic is, don't give me all the details about your laws and case and arguments in this debate and that debate. Get rid of your dilemmas. Let me just remind you, do you know God? Do you know why he created? Do you know why he even made male and female? Fundamentally, it's connected to the principle and the purpose and the glory of marriage. Marriage is to be between one man and one woman, and only one man and only one woman, together, united for life, never to be separated. That's the design. If, like some have said, if polygamy was okay, then God would have made Adam and several women. If homosexuality was to be okay, then it would have been Adam and some other guy. But it's not. It's as though the picture of creation itself removes every distraction, puts front and center with a massive spotlight and says, that's the moral compass. Adam had no one else. Eve had no one else, and they could not go anywhere else. They only had each other, and it was so powerful. When they beheld each other, they were unique among all creation. And their intimacy was the greatest level of intimacy of all. This is the picture that all marriages should have. It is as though there is no other. It's a powerful picture. Male and female, he says. And said to them, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother. That's a strong word, shall leave. And this speaks of the priority of the marriage over the relationship with parents. Some parents don't like to hear that. But mark it. God's design is that parents should not interfere with marriage. It's like a plant. When a plant, through its natural designed process, it bears a seed, and the seed drops off and is broken away from the parent plant and becomes its own. And so it is to be with marriage. It doesn't mean that you disown and you no longer have a wonderful, honoring relationship of love between parents and children. Of course you do. There's a commandment about it. Honor your father and mother, even to the point where they can't even help themselves. So you honor them and don't make excuses. But this idea of dependency, this idea of interference, this idea of who lords the marriage, no. A man shall leave his father and mother. And then he shall hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. There's something there about, and the man shall hold fast. There's something there, men, that you, me, men are to take the initiative to seek out and hold fast to your wife. There's something there. Both are holding. Both must covenant. But there's something there about the powerful initiative of the man. And isn't that the picture of Christ and the church? He seeks her out. He holds her fast. And when she stumbles, he carries her. So brothers, we take initiative to love our wives. We take initiative like the last chapter told us about forgiveness. We take initiative. So he shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, hold on to her with all his might, and the two shall become one. And what does that stress? Only but permanence? He doesn't say the two shall become two together, sharing things together, living in the same house together. Two different people, but we happen to share a lot. This isn't a social construct. It's not something for convenience. It's not an expedience. This is God's business. And he says, look, just like I made you to be one. Something that's made to be one shouldn't be separated. Like my body is made to be one. And if I took a knife and tried to separate, I don't think I'd have a good day. And that's the point. You are to ever give room and give place to the idea that, this prenuptial idea. Oh, I'm going to commit my life to you for better, for worse, till death do us part, or if I choose to leave, and then I want to make sure my securities are preserved. Are you kidding me? That's not Christian. It's not made to be separated, ever. So, all of this, the permanence, the covenant, if I had more time, we'd walk through that. And lastly, the intimacy. Because in Genesis, it ends after it says, and the two shall become one flesh. It ends with, and they were both naked and not ashamed. And it speaks very deeply of that wonderful human experience of the deepest level of intimacy between any two people. And that is reserved, children, in all. It is reserved for marriage alone. It is precious, it is sacred, and it is a delight before God. We don't think in these categories. We act like, no, this is my private life. God's out of it. No. Have you not read? He designed you for it. It is his. It belongs to him. He's the maker of it all. And so the intimacy should be something that shouldn't terminate on us as though it's just for me, like I'm a self-seeking pleasure maniac. It's designed to bring glory to God and thanksgiving and grow unity and love and express and exchange that deepest intimate oneness. That's what it's for. It's to be a service to your beloved. Well, I think he says a lot about marriage in a short order, doesn't he? He is the maker of it. It belongs to him, but he's also the master. And the last point, and this is quickly, he's the master of marriage. Let's look at verse 6. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. You notice how he just picks it up right there and says, let me make this very clear. They're no longer two, but they're one. And what therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Beloved and friends, mark this. He did not say, what God has joined together, let not a man. And that's an important distinction. Because he's not comparing one man to another, like the husband to an adulterous man. He's comparing humanity to God. What God has joined together, let not a human being break apart. The fundamental issue is this. No man is master of his own marriage. Let it sink in. No man is master of his own marriage. And that's the point of the whole debate. They're coming to him and saying, and it's all, in this world, it was all about men divorcing women. And so there's this idea of, on what grounds can a man justify divorce? They're initiating, they're pursuing it. And this is such a powerful rebuttal. And effectively what he says is, listen, God makes the marriage, a man does not. And therefore, God alone can break the marriage, not a man. No man is master of his own marriage. God is master of the marriage. That's the key. So the issue is that divorce is not only unnatural according to the design, according to the creation, but divorce is a rebellion against God, the master of marriage. So he's not saying that it's not possible for two people to be divorced. It's not possible for a man to divorce his wife. He's not saying that's not possible. He's saying it's flat wrong. It's sin. So what do? Well, let's take a look at what they do. Verse 7. And they said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce to send her away? And he said to them, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. So here's the issue. Again, an exception should never be made a rule, and bad concessions to wickedness should never be put up as a standard for making decisions. He's saying, you said Moses commanded it. I say he allowed it. The issue here is it was a provision in the latter law because divorce was so prevalent, even in Israel at the time. It came from Egypt. They came from Egypt and divorce was all over. So if you read Deuteronomy 24, you'll find that it's actually not a law about divorce and remarriage. It's actually just a concession on the given already presupposed situation. They're already divorcing like crazy. So what Moses did is he issued a certificate which created a greater difficulty for those divorcing, namely the man. It made him, put the onus on him to make sure he went through the process legally, and it was all designed to protect the wife. So he had to put in her hand a certificate. And the certificate would say basically this. It would say, lo, thou art free to marry any man. So it would be the man releasing her obligation, and it would free her to marry another. Otherwise, she couldn't marry. So Jesus is saying, this is all wrong. It's not about you. It's not about you mastering this. You don't make this decision. It's not been that way since the beginning. Now, let me point out one last thing, and this one is the one I get so excited about. Look at what he says in verse 8 toward the end. Because of your hardness of heart, what? Moses. And what does he say in verse 9? And I say to you. Hold on. Did you just see that? Or was that just me? Okay. We have Jesus speaking to Pharisees, putting himself in the place of God, and says, yeah, the written word says this, but I say this. This is Matthew 5:17 all over again. I did not come to abolish, I came to fulfill. And unless you have righteousness that surpasses them, you got nothing. He's the one who fulfills all the law, and he's the one of all righteousness, and he effectively puts himself there as the master and maker of marriage and declares, I have the authority. I have the authority to define the terms of marriage, as though I was in the beginning when they were made. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. I wish I had more time to go into that. For now, let's just leave it with this, that Jesus points it back to him. He reveals himself as the maker and the master of marriage. And therefore, anyone who wishes to live a Christ-centered and kingdom-word life, well, we must understand that the intent, that the design, that the glory, the purpose and the joy of marriage from the beginning has been one of one man and one woman joined together for life, never to be separated, with the deepest permanence, oneness, and intimacy. And that's why the disciples responded, if that's the way marriage is to be, then maybe it's better we don't marry, because that sounds an awful lot like a massive commitment. Bingo. You see, don't get caught up in the exception clause. We can deal with that another time. That's not what the disciples picked up on. What they picked up on was the thrust of it. Marriage is glorious. I pray that we would honor it. J.C. Ryle says this, and as we close, speaking of marriage, it is a relation which was instituted in paradise in the time of man's innocence and is chosen as an image of the mystical union between Christ and his church. It is a relationship which nothing but death ought to terminate. It is a relationship which is sure to have the greatest influence on those it brings together for happiness or for misery, for good or for evil. Beloved and friends, please remember, the only way we can do this is to remember why we exist. Not to make much of ourselves, not to be self-satisfying people. Marriages die because pride lives. But to be humble, self-giving, to be Christ-centered and kingdom-ward. And for those, again, who are struggling just with the pain of it, let us remember that this is on the journey to the cross that covers all sin. I invite any and everyone who hears this message, that if you've not repented from the sin of fornication, adultery, or any other sexually related sin or marital sin, I invite you to repent and place your trust, your faith in this glorious Christ, for his cross, his death, his substitution will redeem you. Let us pray. Father, thank you for the glorious reminder of Christ, that he is the maker and the master of marriage. Help us all, I pray, Father, to think, to desire, to speak, and to live in a way that reflects and makes much of Christ in marriage. I pray for every young one here. My heart is especially burdened for them. They live in a time and a place, a milieu of so much filth. Father, please protect them. Protect their eyes and their hearts and their cravings. And please bring them godly men and women at the proper time. May they fear you all their days. And may they covenant before you, the living God, the maker and master of marriage. And help all of us, Father, who are married, to be renewed and to live a kingdom-ward life in our marriage. And help all of those who are widowed or who have been divorced. Comfort, heal, strengthen, encourage. May we as a church be unashamed to proclaim the truth for the glory of Christ and the joy of all people in Christ. We pray. Amen.